Life Stories presents a gripping tale of survival, secrets, and redemption. Luke Carter, a seasoned truck driver, unexpectedly finds himself in a life-or-death situation when he rescues a young woman from a snowstorm, only to discover she's the daughter of a powerful criminal he's been running from for years. Together, they must confront the shadows of the past and fight against the dark forces that seek to destroy them. Join us as we delve into a journey of courage, betrayal, and a fight for freedom. Subscribe to our channel to begin today's story. I've spent the better part of my life behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, navigating the roads of this vast country. It's a job that gets into your blood. A job that you can't really explain to someone who hasn't done it. You see things out there on the highway. Sunrises over empty stretches of road. Storm clouds rolling in like vengeful gods. And the occasional hitchhiker trying to catch a ride to the next town. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to encounter on this bitterly cold winter night. The snow was falling thick and fast, swirling in gusts that obscured the road ahead. The wind howled like a ghost, rattling against the side of my rig as I pushed forward, determined to finish my last delivery of the night. It had been a long shift, one of those that stretched longer than expected. The weather had taken a turn for the worse, and I was tired, my body aching with every mile I drove. But I'd been on the road for hours, nearly 18 of them, and the warmth of my modest apartment had never sounded more inviting. As I rounded a bend on a particularly isolated stretch of highway, my headlights swept across something that didn't quite belong. At first, I thought it was just the snow playing tricks on my eyes. Maybe a fallen branch or a forgotten jacket. But as I drew closer, I saw that it was a person, slumped against the side of the road, her body partially buried in the snowdrift. My stomach twisted, and instinctively, I eased off the accelerator. My hand flicked the hazard lights on, and my heart started pounding in my chest. I pulled the truck to a stop a few yards away from her. I threw on my thick winter coat, my boots crunching against the fresh snow as I stepped out into the bitter cold. Every part of me wanted to turn back, to ignore it, pretend I hadn't seen her, and keep driving, but something in me wouldn't let me do that. I knew I couldn't leave her out here. She was curled up in a fetal position, her body nearly swallowed by the snow. I knelt down beside her, my breath visible in the freezing air, and reached out hesitantly, brushing the snow away from her face. Her skin was icy to the touch, her lips tinged with blue, her dark hair fanned out across the snow, like a stark contrast against the white of the night. Her clothes, a thin coat and a simple dress, were completely inadequate for the freezing temperatures. The sight of her in such a fragile state struck a chord deep inside me. One that I hadn't expected. "Hey, can you hear me?" I asked, my voice trembling more than I'd care to admit. I gently shook her shoulder, but she didn't stir. My heart quickened as I pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck, searching for a pulse. It was faint, but it was there. She was alive, barely. Hypothermia had already set in, and if I didn't act fast, I knew she wouldn't make it. My mind raced. I couldn't waste any time. Without thinking, I scooped her up in my arms. She was so light, barely more than skin and bones. Her head lolled against my chest as I carried her back to the truck, each step taking more effort than the last. I climbed into the cab, my breath coming in short bursts, my muscles screaming from the strain of holding her. I set her down carefully on the passenger seat, then cranked the heater to full blast. The warmth from the truck began to cut through the cold, but it wasn't enough. I grabbed a blanket from the back of the truck and wrapped it tightly around her trembling form. My hands were shaking as I unscrewed the lid on my thermos, trying to get her to sip the warm liquid. "Come on, sweetheart, just a little," I coaxed gently, but she didn't respond. She barely stirred, her eyelashes fluttering, but she didn't open her eyes. I cursed under my breath. I needed to get her to a hospital, but the nearest one was miles away. And in this storm, it felt like the world was closing in on me. The radio crackled with static, the weather station warning travelers to stay off the roads. Too late for that, I thought bitterly. I had no choice but to press on. My mind spun with questions. What was she doing out here in the middle of nowhere? Had she been in an accident? Was she abandoned? Whoever had left her here. They hadn't cared. They hadn't even thought to check if she was still alive. But I couldn't let myself get lost in those thoughts. The only thing that mattered right now was getting her to safety. I knew there was a small truck stop about 20 miles ahead. It wasn't a hospital, but it was shelter. They had a payphone there. And at least I could call for help. I glanced over at the girl again. Her breathing was shallow, and her face had the pale, almost ghostly quality of someone who was on the edge of death. I had to keep her conscious. "Hey," I said gently, "you're going to be all right. Just hang in there." As I pushed the truck forward, the snowstorm intensified, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The headlights barely cut through the thick curtain of white. My knuckles turned white on the steering wheel as I fought to keep control of the truck. Every muscle in my body was tense, my mind running through the worst-case scenarios. But then, just as I thought things couldn't get any worse, the girl's lips barely moved, and a faint whisper cut through the silence. "Don't let him." I froze. "What?" I asked urgently, my voice raw with fear. Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't respond. A chill ran down my spine. And it wasn't just from the cold. Something wasn't right. Then I noticed something else, something small. As I adjusted the blanket around her, a leather wallet slipped from the folds of her coat and landed in my lap. Hesitantly, I picked it up. It felt wrong to go through someone's belongings without their permission. But I needed to know who she was. Maybe there was an emergency contact inside. I opened the wallet and pulled out the ID. When I saw the name printed on it, my blood ran cold. My heart stopped for a beat. Emma Lawson. I knew that name. It was a name I hadn't thought about in years. But the moment I saw it, everything clicked into place. I knew exactly why she was out here. She wasn't just some random girl in distress. She was the daughter of Marcus Lawson, a man I had been running from for the last 10 years. The realization hit me like a freight train. Emma Lawson wasn't just a victim of some accident. Someone had put her here. And whoever that was, whoever had sent her into the cold to die alone, they were coming for her. And if they were coming for her, they were coming for me, too. The weight of the discovery hit me like a ton of bricks. Emma Lawson, the daughter of Marcus Lawson. It all made sense now. The cold, the snow, the desperate condition she was in. She wasn't just some random girl in need of help. She was a pawn in something much bigger. Something I hadn't wanted to deal with again. Marcus Lawson was no small-time criminal. He was a man who'd run with dangerous people. Men who didn't care about the law or anything else. He controlled a vast empire built on fear and blood. And now his daughter was lying unconscious in my truck. A living, breathing reminder of the hell I thought I'd left behind. I forced myself to focus on the road ahead. The snowstorm was getting worse. But the truck stop was only about 20 miles away. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. At this point, all I could think about was getting Emma out of the cold and making sure she survived long enough to get help. But my mind kept returning to one thing. Whoever had put her out there in the snow, whoever had sent her to die, was still out there, and they were coming for her. The storm raged on, the wind howling against the truck. But my thoughts were spinning. I couldn't let them find her. I couldn't let them find me, either. I glanced over at Emma again. Her skin had regained some color, but her breathing was still shallow. I wasn't sure how much longer she could hang on. She had muttered something earlier. Something about not letting him. Who was she talking about? Who was she afraid of? The thought gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The truck stop finally came into view. A faint glow through the blizzard. It wasn't much, just a diner with a few gas pumps and a convenience store, but it was a place to stop. To regroup, I pulled the truck into the nearly empty parking lot and killed the engine. As soon as I stepped out of the truck, the cold hit me like a punch to the gut. I wrapped the blanket tighter around Emma's frail body and carried her inside. The diner was mostly empty. A tired-looking waitress stood behind the counter, and a lone trucker nursed a cup of coffee in a corner booth. The waitress looked up from her crossword puzzle when she saw me enter. carrying the girl. Her eyes widened in surprise. What happened to her? She asked. Already moving toward me. I found her on the side of the road. I said, my voice tight with anxiety. She needs help. Can you call an ambulance? The waitress nodded, moving toward the phone behind the counter. I carefully laid Emma down in one of the booths, keeping the blanket wrapped tightly around her. I stood there for a moment, my mind still reeling from the discovery of who she was. A sense of unease settled in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right. I turned my attention back to Emma. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment. But she didn't speak. Her fingers twitched slightly under the blanket. And I could see the fear in her eyes. She was still aware enough to know that something was wrong. But she didn't have the strength to say it. I glanced toward the door. Then back to the waitress, who was frowning as she held the phone. Phones are down, she said, her voice laced with frustration. The storm must have knocked out the lines. Great, I thought bitterly. My phone hadn't worked either. And now this. Emma needed help. And I was stuck in the middle of nowhere, with no way to reach out for assistance. I sat down in the booth next to her, my mind spinning. The storm outside was howling. The world beyond the diner lost in a veil of snow. As I sat there, trying to figure out what to do next, the door swung open, and a gust of icy wind swept in, rattling the blinds. I didn't think much of it at first. But then I saw him, a tall man in a heavy black coat, his boots clicking against the floor as he entered. He looked around, his eyes scanning the room with cold precision. His gloved hands were shoved deep into his pockets. But there was something about the way he moved. Something calculated and controlled. This wasn't just some trucker coming in for a cup of coffee. The look in his eyes told me he was looking for someone. I forced myself to stay calm, trying to shield Emma from view. I didn't want this man to know she was here. He wasn't just a regular guy. He was one of them, the kind of man Marcus Lawson sent to clean up messes. The man walked up to the counter, leaning in to speak to the waitress. His voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it. Looking for someone, a young woman, dark hair. She might have come through here, he said. The waitress blinked, clearly trying to keep her cool. Haven't seen anyone like that, she replied, glancing at him with feigned indifference. The man's eyes flicked toward the booths, and my heart skipped a beat. He wasn't looking at the waitress anymore. He was looking at me. His eyes swept over me, pausing for a moment as if something didn't sit right. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to the door. I held my breath, but just as he reached for the handle, he hesitated. He turned his head slightly, just enough to glance back. His eyes met mine for a brief second, and I knew in that moment that he knew exactly who I was. His gaze was cold, calculating, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of the past come crashing down on me. The man stepped outside, disappearing into the storm, and the diner fell silent. I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settle in. This wasn't just a coincidence. Whoever that man was, he wasn't just looking for Emma. He was hunting her. And now, it seemed, he was hunting me too. I stayed frozen for a few moments after the man left, my mind still spinning from the brief, tense interaction. His eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, had said everything I needed to know. He wasn't here for coffee. And he wasn't going to give up. Whoever he was working for, they were coming for Emma. They were coming for me, too. I glanced at Emma, who was still unconscious in the booth, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She had muttered something before slipping back into her stupor, something that sent chills down my spine. Don't let him. Who was she talking about? Who was she afraid of? And why had she ended up in my truck, freezing in the middle of nowhere? I leaned forward and gently shook her shoulder, hoping to wake her, but she just stirred slightly and murmured, "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "You're safe," I said, my voice as calm as I could manage. "I found you on the side of the road. You're gonna be okay." Her wide eyes darted around the diner, scanning the booths, the flickering sign outside the window, and then landing on the door. Panic flashed across her face. "Did anyone else come?" she asked urgently. her hands shaking as they gripped the blanket. I frowned. What do you mean? Who's after you? She was breathing heavily now, her eyes wild with fear. A man in a black coat. He's looking for me. He'll hurt me if he finds me. My stomach twisted, and a sense of dread crept over me. I already knew the answer, but I had to ask anyway. Who is he? Emma? Who's after you? Her gaze fell to the table, and she hesitated. My father sent him, she said, her voice breaking. My father. She trailed off, not needing to say more. The weight of it hung in the air between us. Marcus Lawson, the name I had spent 10 years running from. I had to stop myself from letting my shock show. I'd known the moment I saw her ID who she was. But hearing her speak her father's name aloud sent a ripple of unease through me. I'd spent a decade of my life trying to forget Marcus Lawson and everything he represented. The violence, the bloodshed, the fear. I thought I'd escaped it. But here I was, pulled right back into it. I ran a hand through my hair, frustration boiling inside me. Why are you running from him? Emma? I asked, my voice softer now. What happened? Emma closed her eyes, squeezing them shut as if trying to block out the memories. When she opened them again, they were filled with a mix of terror and determination. I found something, she whispered, her voice shaking. I found a list of names, transactions, deals, things I wasn't supposed to see. My father, he's been hiding things. Horrible things. And when he found out I knew. She faltered, her breath coming faster now. He sent men to kill me. To silence me. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. This wasn't just a case of a daughter running from her father. This was something deeper. This was about exposing a criminal empire. And Emma had stumbled onto something she shouldn't have. And now, she was running for her life. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call the police. If I did, Marcus Lawson would know exactly where she was. I couldn't let that happen. But I also couldn't just let her go off alone. Not with people like that after her. As I sat there, trying to figure out our next move, the waitress from earlier returned. She handed me the phone. The lines are back up, she said, her voice a little quieter now. You can make a call. I picked it up, my fingers trembling as I dialed the number I knew by heart, David Hayes. He was the one person I knew who might be able to help us. But there was no telling how dangerous it would be to drag him into this. The phone rang 3 times before David picked up. Carter? His voice was sharp, alert. What the hell is going on? I ran a hand through my hair again, trying to steady myself. David, I need your help, I said, my voice low. It's about Marcus Lawson. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Lawson? David's tone shifted immediately. Where are you? I'm at a truck stop. Just off Route 35. I need you to get here. Fast. On my way, he replied, and then hung up. I turned back to Emma, my mind racing. David was the only one I trusted to help. But I knew what we were about to do wasn't going to be easy. Marcus Lawson wasn't just a crime boss, he was powerful, dangerous, and he didn't take kindly to threats or betrayals. I leaned forward, my eyes meeting Emma's. Listen, I said, my voice firm. We can't stay here. We have to go. I don't know who else is after you. But I know one thing for sure. No one is safe as long as your father is involved. You're not running anymore. We're going to take this fight to him. Emma stared at me, wide-eyed. She was exhausted, terrified, but there was a glimmer of something else in her eyes, resolve. I'm done running, she whispered. I want to fight. I nodded. Good. We're in this together now. And we're not stopping until it's over. The plan was simple, at least. As simple as it could be. We had to go after Marcus Lawson, expose the list, and destroy everything he'd built. But we had to be smart. Because there was no going back now. The storm outside continued to rage. But we were going into the eye of it. Together. As the truck roared to life. I glanced over at Emma. Her grip on the flash drive tightened. The weight of the decisions ahead settling in her eyes. We weren't running anymore. The storm outside seemed almost symbolic. An end to the past. A beginning to something new. The road ahead was long and uncertain. But for the first time, Emma didn't look afraid. She looked determined. The girl who had spent years hiding from her father's empire had found a new resolve, no longer a victim, but a fighter. And for me, well, I knew that everything I'd run from had led to this moment. As the snow fell thick and heavy around us, we drove into the unknown. We didn't have all the answers, and we didn't know what the next day would bring. But we knew one thing. There was no turning back now. We were going to make sure Marcus Lawson would never control anyone again. And that Emma would finally have the freedom she deserved. In the rearview mirror, the storm raged on, but we weren't looking back anymore. And so, our fight began. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring and thrilling life stories.